three. Well, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, welcome to the Knack on Australia podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's really lovely to be here.
I thought I'd start with some light questions and gradually ramp up into harder ones.
Sure.
Last night, the ARIA Music Awards were held, and you're a
Oh,
singer
yeah.
in a variety of hip hop, country, and other bands over the years. So,
Yeah.
what styles and groups do you now listen to these days?
My goodness. I'm almost at the moment got a bit of a, uh, like I feel music's a sensitive subject only because my wonderful husband, who's an extraordinary musician and an artist, has experienced a level of cancel culture from the music industry in this country. And as many people know, we were both singer-songwriters. It's how our relationship began as artists and through the music scene here in Alice Springs. I've it's really disheartening and really extraordinarily disappointing to see how my husband has been treated by members of the music industry in Australia simply because of the fact that he's my husband. That I'm his wife. And also, I suppose that he has, proudly stood in support of the Jewish community here in Australia and Israel with the conflicts going on in the Middle East. And we've seen a lot of remarkable Aussies come under attack because of that as well. Deborah Conway, if I think off the top of my head, Hayley Mary is another one that in recent times, just simply because she wore a MAGA hat. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I can't be bothered watching the ARIAs to be honest, but there are some wonderful artists, and I suppose I get fed a lot of music by
Mm.
Colin, because I'm one of these people that's like, I'll keep going back to my all-time favorites, whether it's my 90s hip hop playlist or whether it's, Sade, whether it's Aretha Franklin or some of those old classics, in terms of music. So really, I rely on my husband a lot to I suppose he generates my new playlist, and there's a lot of wonderful artists that we sort of listen to. And because of his regular association with touring, going over to Nashville quite regularly and performing at the Americana Festival, there's some great artists. I think Americana is really a genre that um, I love a lot. And there's some great artists from Nashville. War and Treaty, actually a husband and wife duo, African American husband and wife duo, who are just some remarkable artists. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. There's so many that I sort of can't think of um, artists. Maybe afterwards I can
We'll
provide a list of, because I think it's
we'll
really important
we'll drop
to.
your Spotify playlist in the show notes so people can,
Yeah, yeah,
check it.
yeah.
Yeah, do it that way.
That's what.
Um,
Definitely.
you were involved in hip hop in Alice Springs. I was just kinda curious because the impact of Black American music on Aboriginal communities is significant, both for positive and negative reasons.
Mhm.
What what do you think? How is it more destructive than it is positive or not?
Look, I mean, I think anything being creative is a great outlet, which, growing up in a place like Alice Springs was the reason why. I mean, I always loved music. I was sang in the choir as a little girl. I played violin as a youngster. Creativity was a part of who I was. So when I was a teenager and part of my hip hop crew, our approach toward our music was we'd love it for starters. I was never a big gangster rap fan.
Mm.
I was more the empowered, Salt and Pepper, TLC, the strong woman. That was really what inspired me a lot. But within the opportunity to gig around my hometown, especially as teenagers, we wanted to demonstrate a positive image of Indigenous teenagers, I suppose, uh, so that we could demonstrate to our community, we're not all running amok and doing the wrong thing, but also to demonstrate to our peers that who were struggling with lives at home and the challenges that they face, that there's an outlet, there's a way to deal with those circumstances in your life in a creative way that's really helps you to grow and express who you are at the same time. So I think, yeah, I think in that regard, definitely. I mean, you can see that there are some negative aspects to it, like the whole concept victimhood mentality, which can also come out in a lot of hip hop, which young Indigenous people choose to adopt, not because culturally, historically, there's similarities, because we don't have similarities. So, to if anything, to the US, it's to the Native American Indian population as opposed to the African American population historically. But that people can certainly be captured by that victim mentality and the concept that somebody else owes you something because of what you what the adversity you've experienced in your life. I suppose it's just who you end up being influenced by, and more broadly in your life as well, that dictates to you how you choose what kind of music suits you best, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I just think it's really important that conservatives have a bit of a cultural hinterland and are aware of the culture around them, right? Because it's not
Totally.
just that you're not just all dry policy that moves people and moves nations. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, as conservatives, we have allowed the left to capture the arts, and, this sort of we go by this sort of, um, stereotype that, we're for the arts, but that we're only for opera and theatre and those sorts of things, whereas I think we as conservatives also need to broaden our understanding of music and the arts, and that it does belong to us all. Which I think, again, I'll go back to my husband because he's on a bit of a crusade at the moment to do
Yeah.
that. Um, he's launching on the 28th of this month a song which is about demonstrating. He's brought together artists from around the country from various different backgrounds that are sort of representative of who we are as a country, and that the arts doesn't belong to one side of politics. It belongs to everybody, and culture is upstream from politics. It's about who we are, and we shouldn't let one side hold us to ransom to it, but understand we we all own it, and our music is as much a part of us as conservatives as anybody else in this country. And yeah, so he's working on a project called This Land. There's a documentary. There's a song coming out, and I'm lucky enough to continue to live my life, vicariously, I suppose, through him being the creative that I am. But I'd love for our side of politics to, I suppose, appreciate more, create the creative sides of who we are and the creative side of our country as well, because I think it's important in terms of our identity and our culture as a country.
Yeah, and I often think too that it's so often the case that the side that wins politically tends to be the ones that are sort of culturally ascendant.
Mm.
In the last presidential election, the old hip Obama brand had become very tawdry, and yet the new right were the ones at the glamorous dinner parties and was presenting a much more sort of attractive scene and brand than had done in the past. So, hey, let's shift gears slightly and get into the more boring political stuff. Um, we were originally going to speak last week, but you were called to a very important meeting in Canberra for a
Mm,
vote
mm.
to discuss the Liberal Party's policy on net zero. What exactly is the position of the coalition now?
Well, our position is affordable energy for Australians, ultimately prioritising that over what the Labor government have done is to prioritise emission reduction. and also, I mean, I suppose Labor have prioritised the green energy grifters and the UN globalists as opposed to putting Australians first, which is why we've got such the situation that we've got to in terms of the increase in our power prices, the increase in cost of living. You know, energy is the economy, and so it's not just everyday mums and dads that are struggling to make ends meet to pay their bills, but businesses are also struggling to meet their costs. But also, you know, net zero has become this sort of overwhelming, overarching policy that dictates how we live our lives. And I suppose I was always confused as to why those on our side of the fence would support this policy, given that as a Liberal Party, ultimately we are about liberty. We are about the freedom of choice for the Australian people, and net zero has limited our freedom of choice, our opportunities. It dictates to farmers, what they can produce. It dictates to industry what they can produce. And when you're increasing costs for businesses, then you're increasing costs for what they manufacture, for the food we eat, for the cars that we drive. I mentioned it in our party room meeting that there was a time when, I was a teenage mother. I was about 19, having had my second child, and even under those tough circumstances, I was living in a country that allowed me the opportunity, myself and my husband at the time, to purchase our first home, even at that age, under those circumstances. And I think of my kids at the moment, who are my 26-year-old has just become a dad, and he and his fiance want to own a home. They're struggling to save up toward that. My 24-year-old has just gone through the process of trying to find his first car that he wants to purchase, and he's very limited in terms of what he can buy for what he can afford. And that is all because of the ridiculous tax the ute tax. I mean, he wanted to buy a ute, for crying out loud, but a ute is a hell of a lot more expensive now than what it was when I was younger. And we're being squeezed and pushed into a direction where the expectation is the population should be buying EVs. Well, that's not going to work for a person in a remote community. Um, I don't know if anyone's ever seen the Bush Mechanic program, but which came out years ago, which were all my uncles, by the way. But running around the scrub with a broken down car and doing all kinds of things like stuffing tires with Spinifex to keep the car moving. You're not going to be able to do that with an EV. I mean, it's got it's just restricting our lives, and restricting our freedom of choice, and it's a hell of a lot more expensive for us. So as the Liberal Party, as part of the coalition, we're like, well, hang on a second. We've got wonderful resources. I mean, we've got the cleanest coal in our country, and we're shipping it off to places like China, so they can utilize it for their energy needs. We emit 1% of global emissions. The IPA just released a paper that tells us that every 12 days, China's actually emitting, uh, every 12 days, the same amount as what we're emitting in a year annually. So why are we hurtling toward net zero at breakneck speed, making Australians poorer? To try to achieve net zero. And so, yeah, I mean, we want to make sure that we're technology neutral, so that we're utilising our own resources, things like gas. Obviously, we don't want to shut down coal-fired power stations until they've come right to the end of their usage, especially when they're providing the baseload power that we need to keep the economy running. But nuclear, we need to have a debate on nuclear, and we need to be able to tap into the resources that we have as a country. We've got some of the largest uranium resources in the world, right here in my own backyard in the Northern Territory. Um, we need to push back on Labor's fear-driven agenda, uh, and the fact that on one hand they want to support um, nuclear-powered submarines for our defence, but not have a debate around nuclear energy, which we know the countries around the world that are striving for net zero themselves have an abundance of nuclear power in their backyards. And if you want to see that as a working example, you only have to look at Lucas Heights, that has been functioning for the last 50 years in the backyard in Sydney there. It's just, yeah, this is the position we want to be able to take.
So at the last federal election, the Dutton campaign did keep its commitment to net zero, but it was pushing nuclear and other cost of living kind of pressures. But they famously did not do so well. What explains that? Why did the LNP do so poorly at the last federal election? And what explains the record lows, not only for the Liberal Party, but the centre-right more broadly at the moment?
Yeah, look, I mean, it was it was disappointing to see that we were leading in the polls up until February, which I feel like uh, part of our frustration for myself and some of my colleagues that were in shadow cabinet at the time. We had a number of policies which were ready to go, which in the end it came down to headquarters determining when we could or couldn't make those announcements on policies. But because I suppose we had a lack of announcements um, on a number of policies, we weren't demonstrating to the Australian people why we should be the next government. We weren't selling them what we had in our back pocket, and so that was a huge frustration. Also, I feel like there was just some certainly, well, the polling wasn't right to begin with. Uh, it was some wrong advice that had come to us and that we were going with. But I also feel, in a sense, that there was a lot of steps that were taken that were fear driven, as opposed to having conviction and going, no, this is where we stand on these positions, and like it or not, we're going to sell this to you as the Australian people. And I think uh, the nuclear the nuclear option, I think probably Australia wasn't prepared for that at the time. And, Labor certainly were able to weaponize the whole cost factor to scare off Australians to support our policy. But also, I think there was sort of lack of involvement to sort of get the private market to make determinations in that space as well. And Labor have already been offering subsidies, and we were sort of offering similar sort of things like subsidising nuclear and using taxpayer dollars to get that all set up. And I just don't think we sold it well enough, and we didn't push back on the fear mongering from Labor. We also didn't highlight the ridiculous costs being incurred by Labor because of their net zero policy at the time as well.
Mm.
They kept their cards close to their chest and wouldn't even mention anything in terms of the cost of net zero. But those comparisons, I think, could have been stronger. And I think we backed off a little bit and got too scared toward the end there instead of driving through.
Yeah, people do kind of latch onto the or latch onto the vibe. If you're sort of overly defensive, then you sort of project fear, and then people think you're not confident enough to lead, I suppose. While the centre right in Australia is at a low, the political right globally has actually had an enormous amount of success. I mean, in the United
Mm.
States, the restructured Republican Party is in charge. In the UK, Nigel Farage's Reform is massively up in the polls. These movements have a different style and a different policy platform to traditional conservatism of, say, John Howard or George W. Bush. What can Australians on the right here learn? What do we need to do differently, if anything?
Yeah, look, I mean, I suppose, they also have different electoral systems, in the UK, and in the US, but I'm a strong believer that, and I think, I I know we're pushing for that. There are those of us within the Liberal Party room that are pushing for, actually speaking to those who feel overlooked, which is certainly what Nigel Farage has done with reform, which is certainly what Trump has done as well, and to have a level of institutional courage, to hold the bureaucracies to account for their failures, which is something that obviously I've been talking about for quite some time, within the Indigenous affairs space, is the need for an inquiry into the funds that are being spent, but also into statutory authorities and Aboriginal organisations and that sort of thing. Um, yeah, I think we definitely need to be able to set up guardrails for unity, because populist energy can bring about the changes that you want to bring. You don't want to bring them too fast and too soon, but you want to be able to channel that constructively. Um, and I do believe there is a change certainly occurring here in Australia, similar to those other Western nations. We always seem to be a couple of steps behind, and I believe we can get on the forefront of this, on the wave, toward this. But we need to be, again, I think what lost us the last election was this fearful approach toward our conviction and what we stand for and what we believe in. You've got to be comfortable with not being liked, but at least when when you're honest and you put your cards on the table, people know exactly what it is you actually stand for. Um, and that's something that we need to do, and that's what's occurring in terms of these movements elsewhere. But um, we need to, again, I've always been a strong believer of establishing a sense of national pride as a country. For too long, this woke, far left approach of self-flagellation and feeling ashamed of who we are because of our country's past, and teaching our children, well, if you're a little white kid in this country, you need to feel ashamed, and if you're an Aboriginal kid, then you need to feel like you're a victim and you're owed something. We need to get the hell away from that. Um, and but we've also got to tackle extremism at the same time and condemn it wherever we see it. The We need to instill a sense of unity and pride in who we are as a country, um, because I think what's happened, and of course, as I said, we need to be able to confront or call out extremism on both sides.
Mm.
And what we've seen, I believe, is a complete and utter lack of leadership from our prime minister. Hence, why there's an increase in uh, protesters in our country. Why there's just been this dramatic sort of uptick in anti-Semitism. Our Jewish community have never felt so fearful than they are at the moment, and the build up toward that ever since October 7. And the fact that there's individuals, that are proudly displaying themselves as Nazis in our streets. I mean, from one extreme to the other, it's just there's been a breakdown of social cohesion, and I think a lot of it has also come from this sense of um, shame of who we are as a country. I mean, that's where it begins. It should never have been that way. We should have always been encouraged to celebrate the successes that we've made, despite the challenges of our history in our country. And I truly believe, in places like the UK and the US have never really had, I don't believe, too much of a struggle with a sense of pride in who they are. I mean, they proudly wave about the American flag, and I mean, I'm very proud to see Australians marching in our streets with the Australian flag, and I am deeply, it angers me when I hear politicians, Labor politicians and such, and those of the left who try to suggest that Australians are racist because they're flying their flag. I mean, that notion crept in some years ago, and there was very little pushback from it. And I think it is absolutely high time that we stood against it. And the wonderful thing is that Australians of all backgrounds are doing exactly that, and are sick of being painted as racists and those that don't care about our country. But yeah, like I said, I mean, we could get on the front foot. We are the Liberal Party and the Coalition are losing support to One Nation. And it is because of the fact that, well, One Nation, what you see is what you get. They've been there for quite some time. You know what they stand for. You either love them or you hate them. But they're growing in popularity because of their convictions, and because of the fact that they celebrate this country. But they're not going to form government at the same time. So we need to get our act together as the coalition to reflect who Australians are now, and what they're calling for, and be a hell of a lot stronger in that regard and in that argument, and stop paying attention to polling, and determining, the wind's blowing this way, so this is how this is the policy we're going to structure around the way the wind's blowing. No, you make the wind blow, like we did with The Voice.
Mm.
If you stand for something, and you deliver your argument with conviction, people will listen, and people that resonates with people.
Mm.
Yeah, that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I like that term guardrails because populism is in response to dissatisfaction, but there needs to be a coherent policy response so that it's
Mhm.
channeled in the right direction. And I feel like that's been lacking at the moment from anyone in Australian politics. And without that, it does go off the rails, and you do get
Yeah.
simply the emotion without the
Yeah.
the solution. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's about taking a calm, common sense approach. Like the mass immigration issue. Uh, and whenever it comes to any of these issues, and the populist approach, there'll be those that will try to paint you with that, oh, you're just trying to whip up a frenzy with the Australian people. It's like, no, no. When you listen to the Australian people, you need to reflect their concerns, and you shouldn't ignore them, because that's when you do get extremism. And we're up against the largely left-wing media who are problematic. But you have to stick to your convictions. You have to take a common sense approach. When we talk about the mass migration issue, it's not about who's coming here. It's about the numbers coming here, and the effect that it's having on our infrastructure and housing, our services. The fact that we need to make sure that young Australians can get the opportunity to own their own home, and the government is just not delivering in terms of housing for this country. So, when you look at the mass immigration argument, the Albanese government have just sort of opened the floodgates and just letting people in, and not even considering what sort of skilled migrants we need to fill the gaps in our country. Not considering that, part of immigration policy is that we send certain skilled migrants to the regions, to places like the Northern Territory, where we need to support our economy with in terms of immigration in the right areas. It's just taking that thoughtful, common sense approach, and at the same time, simultaneously, far out. Who could you believe it, that you're actually also alleviating Australians' concerns and fears, but also demonstrating that no, we're taking that into account, and we want to make sure that we are providing opportunities for Australians first, um, making life easier, not just for long-term citizens, those who are born here, but those who are part of the migrant community, the valued migrant community, that want to be part of Team Australia, that want to contribute meaningfully to their communities, to our country, and of course, to our economy.
Mm. I've never seen detailed polling on this, but I'm always curious. What do you think Aboriginal Australia views are when it comes to mass immigration, or the levels that we've seen recently.
Well, that's right. I mean, and this is it's funny how Labor will all say, always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and there's those sorts of arguments, but that's aimed at the colonizer or anyone with colonizer heritage as opposed to, parts of the migrant community. But I do know that there are Aboriginal people that do have whole concerns, because Aboriginal people want to get ahead too. They want to be homeowners. They don't want to have to deal with the pressures that the Labor government are bringing about. I hate to say it, but there's a hell of a lot of Aboriginal people that support One Nation as well. A lot of Aboriginal people that do, and but there are those that are captured by the grievance industry. There are those that are captured by um, the Aboriginal industry, which is they've got careers in the Aboriginal industry, and that industry is built on the backs of the misery of some of our most marginalised. So they prefer a particular narrative, and they don't want to lose the privileges that they have because the taxpayer brought that about for them. So obviously there's different angles that a lot of different Aboriginal people take in our country. But yeah, there's definitely those that are concerned with the mass immigration issue.
Yeah, I want to just linger a bit longer on Aboriginal affairs, although I deliberately don't want to spend the majority of this interview talking to you about it, because I think you're a lot broader than that. But on this issue, I mean, I just always wonder, like, should the aim in Aboriginal affairs be to make race completely irrelevant, so there are no special government programs for Aboriginal people and individuals should be treated purely on need, which I'm attracted to and it sounds nice? Or should Aboriginal Australia be treated as a type of ethnic minority within a nation, and some effort be made to preserve their identity, and a certain state paternalism is sort of unavoidable to improve the conditions of that people? I mean, it's nice to say that race shouldn't be relevant at all, but I just wonder whether that's actually practically possible in all circumstances.
I think that's the romantic approach toward Indigenous Australia. But the reality is, Indigenous Australians are part of a modern global community as well.
Mm.
And the problem with that thinking is that it restricts Aboriginal people to that concept, as opposed to going, well, these are Australian citizens who should have the same rights, responsibilities, opportunities as every other Australian in this country. And if somebody wants to strengthen their culture, their identity, their language, I don't think it should be the responsibility of the government to do so. Migrant communities are a fine example of that. They hold on to that which is dear to them, but they want to be part of a modern Australia and get ahead in terms of, for their lives. And that should apply to everybody in this country. There shouldn't be a two-tiered system where Aboriginal people are being treated differently just because we're the original inhabitants of this country. But a lot of those approaches have come about by those who, unfortunately, have lost their culture, and part of that they feel they've lost part of their identity. But our most marginalised are those in remote communities who don't have the same opportunities as those individuals, who don't speak English as a first language, who don't have the same level of education, who you won't find in positions in organisations that are CEO or chief financial officer positions, or positions that are significant. And that's where the gap exists. It exists between those who know how to take advantage of the taxpayer-funded system, and those who are told they're victims don't have any agency because their lives are the adversity they're experiencing is someone else's fault and not their fault. So, this romantic notion that an Aboriginal kid from a remote community, if they get an education, they should just go back to their community. Like, There's some that argue that they shouldn't go to boarding school because you're taking the best kids from those communities. Well, who has the right to tell a young person that they should stay in their community and be trapped by that situation for the benefit of their community? We don't tell any other kids in this country of different backgrounds. You need to stay in your community. Don't you shouldn't be going off and getting a boarding school education and then allowing the world to open up to you and finding opportunity wherever you want to find it and have freedom of choice. We say that to no other kids in this country except Aboriginal kids. There's this expectation. And part of that is, in remote communities, it's a cultural expectation. Culture, yes, it's not the be all and end all of in one's life.
Mm.
You should be able to have freedom of choice. You should be able to take elements of your cultural identity that work for you as an individual, and utilize that. But it can also become a trap. The obligation, the expectations, but as a society, we put those expectations on Aboriginal kids. The industry does that. The left do that. They do it to me. I mean, I should act and behave in a particular way because I'm Indigenous, and if I'm not, well, I'm a sellout. But on the same hand, I'm also don't represent Aboriginal people, but somehow I'm owned by the collective. No, again, we're Australian citizens. We should have the same rights, responsibilities, and freedom of choice and opportunity like every other Australian in this country. And if we got rid of race-based policy, you'd start to see the gap close. In the Northern Territory, the race-based policy, the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, is what has kept Aboriginal people in poverty. It is what has produced these socialist enclaves in remote communities where people are completely dependent on either welfare or a government-created position for their work, where you can't have private home ownership or private land ownership. Everything is communally owned, and any decision you want to make about your land has to be done with the support of the community, with your family members, with affected individuals as well through the legislation. And so you can't profit from your own land like people who own a piece of land in this country get to have. So there's a double standard taking place, and it's based on this romantic view of culture and identity and all these things that the people that create this policy don't actually live by themselves.
Mm. Yeah. You've written in your books and articles over the years about the less attractive side to traditional Aboriginal culture, particularly its violence, clannishness, in-group mentality, parochial nature. And this clashes obviously with the sort of Pocahontas view of Native people that's promoted in the popular culture. And I think most people, a lot of Australians who have no direct experience with Aboriginal culture, sort of kind of half subscribe to that. How do you get people to understand what it was really like living in traditional Aboriginal society?
Well, I suppose you just got to keep talking about it and keep writing about it and keep educating people on that. And, there is such pushback on it, which is ridiculous. But, it's like on one hand, only if you're a Western feminist and you come from a colonial background can you challenge the patriarchy. If you're an Aboriginal woman, no, you must toe your cultural line because your culture is amazing, even though those that don't live it want to suggest that to you. We can't. They're holding Aboriginal people back ultimately by denying reality to Aboriginal people. And if Aboriginal people, if we can't turn around, take a mirror to ourselves and take responsibility and understand what we're doing that is detrimental for us, particularly culturally, then our circumstances won't change. And that's the problem. And that's what the industry is built on. That this notion that it's someone else's responsibility, that it's colonization. And the argument that the left want to throw at me is that I ignore the impacts of colonization. No, no, no. I'm not ignoring the impacts of colonization. That's taken place. That's done and dusted. What's happening now? Sure, part of it is probably part to do with colonization, but there's elements of colonization that also allow us to progress forward. Um, and part of that is constructive criticism, which we don't do culturally. We just don't do it. um, but yeah, it's a strange place to be in where you're being lectured by those outside of your culture on how you should respect your own culture when you've seen the destruction of those closest to you, the way it impacts people you love, the fact that it's led to so many deaths and so much violence, and yet these are truths you must not speak of, because if you do that, then you're a sellout or a turncoat or whatever these other things are, because you're genuine about how you want to save people's lives.
Yeah. I mean, European and Northern European and English culture is highly individualistic by global standards, and there's been a lot of academic literature on this. And I sometimes feel less white bread politicians, right, unlike yourself, are in favor of multiculturalism, but don't really understand cultural differences in a deeper sense, whether they're Aboriginal
Mm.
culture or from other parts of the world. They think it's just about food, dresses, and festivals, and that everyone underneath has these individualistic Anglo assumptions. Do you think that's fair?
Totally, totally. It's almost like, if you're part of a family where there's two different cultures, or more than two different cultures as part of your family, it's almost like a different set of logic to Western thinking and Western culture as well. Like, in traditional Aboriginal culture, there's elements of black magic and sorcery that are still very strong within, culturally. And so it is thought that someone has the power to take make you sick or kill you through black magic. Um, any premature death or illness is caused through sorcery in a traditional context, and these are also ways of controlling societies or elements of society. Women in particular in traditional Aboriginal culture, and if you don't come from that sort of background, you don't have a clue, but you will look at things through a Western framework, an individualistic sort of framework, and you will romanticize this notion. Socialists romanticize Aboriginal culture because
Mm.
traditionally you had to. Um, you're living in population sizes of one person every 100 square kilometres for Warlpiri people in the desert. So you had to look after one another for your survival.
Mm.
But nowadays, that's not the case. Nowadays, we are influenced by so many other cultures, not just Western culture, but freedom of choice is not afforded to us once more. And Western society is some of the most successful society are on the face of the earth. And let's face it, capitalism has supported that. And there are formulas that exist in that lead to success in life. Um, and why then shouldn't anybody be allowed to, living in a Western nation, adopt those principles, those formulas to improve upon their own personal lives? Why is it that they're told to remain as they are? Because that is their identity. It's it's crazy, and yeah, I think it's so ridiculous when I'm told, that I'm a coconut or that I'm too white or whatever it is. And um, uh, reality is, I've got Irish, Scottish, Welsh heritage.
Mm.
Well, mostly Scots and English, actually. English, but that is who I am. I'm not going to deny that. And I'll take all the wonderful elements of all my backgrounds to enrich my life. And I don't adhere to uh, this notion that somehow you're just like a white fella, or you're a white fella's puppet, or you're this or you're that. It's like, wow, this is why education is so bloody important in people's lives. Just open your minds a little bit, because ultimately we're all in fact human beings. and it is literally our culture that forms our thinking and our mindset. And it's not good to have an unhealthy mindset. Ultimately, that's what leads you to a destructive life.
Yeah, I mean, but you do take some positive things from traditional Aboriginal culture. You mentioned in your maiden speech some endearing elements about the connection that everyone should feel towards Australia if they've been born here,
Yeah.
um, and yet I was actually thinking about that because I think you describe yourself as a Christian in other ways. So how do you reconcile that sort of traditional folklore with a more Western religious kind of outlook?
Well, I mean, I suppose all human beings on the face of the earth have a um, have to come to this notion of where the world began and how we're created, but also live by a particular set of morals to enhance and enrich your lives and ensure that you're a good person, I suppose. Um, Certainly, you know, I've always celebrated those parts of my traditional culture that really have enriched my life, and that I feel in Aboriginal people traditionally are far more accepting of other human beings than what we're currently experiencing with the activist class. A lot more accepting. And I've seen it because of coming together of my families. And so I always share that concept that I grew up with because it's always reconciliation, which has been another
Mm.
taxpayer funded initiative again, removes the element of humanity, I believe. But um, lived reconciliation to me was what I share is that it's understood that, Aboriginal way, Warlpiri way, for Central Australia, create our ancestors. The land was flat and featureless. They traveled the land. They went into the ground and up into the sky to make land formations, star formations. But as they traveled, they left their spiritual essence in the ground. And then when you are conceived, it's believed the baby spirit leaps from the ground or from a leaf into your mum's belly, giving you a personal connection to this land. I think that's important to share because, one, there's this suggestion that Australians should be proud of their heritage, including their Indigenous heritage, not reinvented culture, but traditional culture that tells us that you're part of this country too. If you are conceived here in Australia, you are connected to this country in a spiritual way, and I believe that people feel that way anyway because Australia has that magnetism, the country itself, the landscape, the natural environment, that anyone who lives here feels drawn to it. And that is what we should build on uh, instead of all these other shallow concepts that have been dreamt up by those who, you know, want to label us all differently. And so I think it's really important to share those parts of who we are that are about being loving one another and supporting one another, inclusive of one another. That is lived reconciliation as opposed to this dreaming things up to spend taxpayer dollars reconciliation. And there's so much to share in that. But I think, as a Christian, I think that, it, especially right now in the times that we live in, is such a shared experience for those who care deeply about humanity and the direction that we're going in, and to to enrich your own life through Christ, um, but also to be able to contribute meaningfully to your communities and to those that are suffering and those who are experiencing adversity. It's such a beautiful um, it's such a beautiful way to connect human beings at the same time. And um, and I think right now there just seems so much turmoil globally that there is a need. Um, well, I certainly have felt the need to turn more toward prayer nowadays than I ever have. Um, but but it is about maintaining a centeredness and being able to continue forward and to be able to not get caught up in the hatred, in the conflict that's taking place around us, but to really fight for what's good for each and every one of us at the same time.
Oh, I think it was a good, it was a great maiden speech, and it was a good little kind of weaving in of the traditional with the modern in it, and yeah, it should. That's sort of the model for the way different cultures should be woven into the Australian fabric, as it were, right? Um, I guess you mentioned reconciliation, so I've had to I was just curious. You know, we have these commemorations for great wars past, Remembrance Day just the other day, and Americans and Japanese reconciled, even though they dropped bombs on each other and fought each other viciously. English, Germans, and French have fought each other for ages and hold no hatred towards each other today.
Mm.
Whatever misdeeds Australian colonialists inflicted on Black Aboriginal Australians, I don't think were anything like the horrors of those conflicts. And yet, why are we not able to say that reconciliation has occurred here, but those other countries? I mean, when there's not this endless saga about whether Japan and America should be reconciled, right?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose those countries don't have a grievance industry, where maintaining a level of separatism uh, ensures jobs and opportunities and
That's
ways
you reckon?
to
That's what
spend
yeah.
taxpayer dollars. I suppose when someone can establish themselves as a victim, um, then there's a reluctance from others to call that out or to question that or anything like that. And when you can make demands from that position, you generally those demands can be met. And we're seeing that in Victoria right now with the signing of the treaty. I mean, they've established a second layer of a second pillar of government, for crying out loud, based on people's heritage, on 7% of the population. Um, yeah, it's just you push and push and push enough, you can get your way. It's about a power struggle now. It's about those who want to take power. Um, Ultimately, that's all I see it being about. I don't see any really real constructive way toward improving anyone's lives from it. But there's also a notion that um, that the only way a lot of Aboriginal people believe there are some Aboriginal people believe that are part of that grievance industry, that the only way to move forward is to lift yourself up is by taking from others or diminishing others, which is largely what the grievance industry has done, I believe, which is why Australians feel so ashamed to call themselves Australians now. It's why there's so much divide, but our leadership in this country has enabled that. Um, and it's really, it's really destructive. And we need to absolutely turn that around. Um, but yeah, I mean, I suppose that's why, some Aboriginal people that I know that were of that thinking, part of the grievance industry, changed their lives and turned toward Christianity themselves and realized that they're not the only people to have been persecuted in the world, you know. And I think that's why I suppose education and history being taught appropriately is really important. Our country's history needs to be taught in its entirety and not for the sake of weaponizing it. I think Tony Abbott's done a remarkable job with his new book, and his documentary that he's brought out, which really demonstrates how the colonies wanted to establish themselves differently and saw themselves differently to Britain and to the crown, and wanted this sense of, okay, we're a new place, we're coming together, we want to bring everyone together, even from a couple of hundred years ago. There was this notion that no, we're building better, we're building new, and this is what we want to do, and we want to do it together. That was overwhelmingly the approach, but young people aren't being taught that. And that is the nuance of our nation's history that is not being taught and needs to be taught. And because it hasn't been taught, I suppose, for some time, there's been a vacuum. which has been, occupied and filled by the grievance industry. And so it's about striking that balance now.
Mm. I mean, I find cultural discussions, both pop cultural and cultures from other parts of the world and Aboriginal culture, very just inherently interesting to talk forever. But you were. I'm also keen to talk about other areas. You were for a time Shadow Minister for Defence Industry and Personnel, and I think you're going to be in charge of the Australian equivalent of cost-cutting Doge or something similar, right? Outside of Aboriginal affairs, what other policy areas really interest you?
Yeah, well, I suppose, I mean, housing's a pretty important one. Education's pretty important. Education lays the foundations for our children, and I think our children have been let down for some time, and they've what they've been experiencing is not education, but ideological indoctrination is what's been taking place.
Mm.
Um, uh, the housing issue is an absolute mess right now for the Australian population. That needs to change. I mean, well, there's a raft of issues that I think are important, and the defence. I really enjoyed my my short time in that portfolio because I think I recognised quite acutely the need for our own, security, but our own sovereign capabilities so that we can defend ourselves, which is sort of non-existent at the moment. And because our economy is in such a terrible position, it's like this government is really reluctant to increase our defence spend to 3% of GDP, which is really, I would suggest, is a basic line that we need to take. Uh, and the fact that we're not investing in encouraging defence industry and small businesses here to support them to grow. Even though there are some remarkable little businesses around our country that are supplying, the Ukrainian defence force or to the US military, and yet our own government is failing to recognise the talent we have and investing in that in Australia. Um, Obviously, yeah, but I mean, our national security is such a huge issue, which I suppose I really appreciated the opportunity to be able to highlight the very real threat from our close neighbours, because we are now, of course, within striking range. You know, I mean, the CCP wouldn't even have to set foot on our soil in order to invade us. There are different ways that we can be attacked, whether it's through a cyber attack or hitting our energy system, our grid, or cutting off from our fuel supplies. That it's as easy as that. Um, but yeah, I suppose there's a raft of areas that
Yeah,
I
that
find.
that anecdote that you gave before about being able to afford a house when you were a teen and pregnant. I mean, that's almost beyond the imagination now of young people that you would be able to do that. Well, and I recall when I was younger that there were people, living in flats in pretty nice parts of, our capital cities that, maybe
Mhm.
three of them are on the dole and they're eating baked beans, but there's no way they would be able to afford to live there now. Why has Australia got so expensive over the last sort of 20 years?
Again, I want to talk about what's gone on recently. The cost of everything has skyrocketed because of, like I said, hurtling toward net zero at breakneck speed. The fact that the government is subsidising the green energy grifters using taxpayer funded dollars to do so, and ruining the economy and our environment at the same time. But also, the government's housing policy is failing. I mean, they are at the moment at a shortfall of, I think, 180,200 homes, and which has increased from their previous shortfall of about 160,000 homes. We were, under the former coalition government, building about 190,000 homes a year. But the Albanese government is failing to keep up with demand, in term and let's not even talk about red tape and regulation, but we need better accountability in terms of funding states and territories in housing infrastructure. Um, well, I was going to say something else. I was on another trajectory there, which but
it just the mind boggles because I think it's affecting our culture, this cost of living, right? Because we used to be very easygoing, and now
mm,
everyone's for massive mortgages.
mhm,
Everything's so expensive.
mm,
There used to be possible to live relatively cheaply in Australia. Now that option doesn't kind of exist anymore, and that can't be
no,
progress.
no, that's right. I mean, I think of going to the supermarket and getting when I do get the opportunity to stay home for a week, getting the weekly shop with my husband, it's bloody expensive, and we can afford that. There was a time where we've got one son at home with us at the moment, but when we had four boys at home, boys eat a lot. I can't imagine, what families are going through who have, four or five kids. They've got to feed them. The school fees, the school activities. The fact that I mean, the cost of food has gone up 15%. Gas has gone up 38%. Electricity's gone up about 39%. Insurance has gone up 37%. So these ongoing costs are just so destructive for Australians right now. And aside from that, is the number of those coming in through the immigration Labor's immigration program at the moment is creating more um, downward pressure on housing, and the fact that we're not keeping up with demand. So yeah, so
Everything
the
flows
cost of
through.
the cost of housing has gone up. They're wanting to provide suggested first home buyers only need to provide 5% deposit, but that's increasing the cost of homes. So that 5% deposit is just consumed by the cost in the end, and they're paying more in the long term.
Yeah. Hey,
So
last couple of questions because I know I've run you over time a little bit. Um, Welcome to country, acknowledgement to country. I remember, you might find this amusing. I went to a Taiwanese Day celebration, and all the different politicians in the room had to do not only Aboriginal recognition, acknowledgement of country for elders past, present, and future, but also the Taiwanese past, present, and future. And I spent a lot of time in China, and the Taiwanese were coming up to me afterwards, going, "Who are they referring to?" Because it's quite a political question. Like, do they mean the Chinese across the strait? Do they mean some of the indigenous Taiwanese? It was just an absolute ridiculous performance. What do you think appropriate protocols for use of acknowledgement to countries should be, if indeed they
yeah.
should at all?
See, I mean, I think we just need to drop this sort of um, symbolism, this performative symbolism that's taking place, and the virtue signaling. I, I cringe every time there's like a acknowledgement, especially when I'm sitting with a room of bureaucrats. I'm the only Indigenous person in the room, and they want to recognise. It's awkward, right? It's like I don't want to be singled out. And I know there's a couple of my boys in high school were like, "Mum, I don't want to be singled out as the Indigenous kid in the room. I just want to be with everybody else." But yeah, it is other countries are looking at us and going, "Why are we doing this as a country? It's not making sense." But uh, yeah, I mean, we're supposed to be one Australia with an Australian identity, and that's made up of so many different other cultures. And I don't think the Aboriginal culture is more important than anybody else's in this country. Certainly not our 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 identity as Australians, in particular. But I think there needs to be a respectful approach that is about including everybody. not just singling out one group, because
Mhm.
we're the original inhabitants of this country. I mean,
It's
I
like
think if questions are asked and people want to know, then yeah, do it, but don't just thrust it upon people to begin with.
it's like corporate Australia. It's like it's like a benediction that they do more times than nuns in a convent. I think
And
every time I meet them.
probably never set foot in an Aboriginal community. You know?
No doubt, right. Last couple of questions, Jacinta, because I know we kept you a while. What does your daily media diet consist of? Where do you get your news?
So, everywhere, I suppose.
Are you on
I
you're on X? Do you
I
read?
am on yeah, I'm on X. I think I'm a bit more of a Facebook person than I am X, only because I just can't be bothered with some of the commentary. Um, but I get a lot of my, information from various different, sources, different papers. Occasionally, I'll look at Fairfax, but I'm probably more likely to read a lot of the News Corp,
Mm.
articles. I like to know what's going on overseas as well, in the UK and in the US. Um, uh, GBN and, uh, the Daily Wire in the US, and places like that. Probably I occasionally look at Substack, because I think there's some really informative, bits and pieces, through there. Um, you know, because of, being involved with ARC, there's also lots of different connections through ARC, Jordan Pearson's,
Yep,
Constantine Christen. Um, did I say Jordan Pearson?
that's right. I'm sure people know who you
You
meant.
know, you knew who I meant. Yeah. But yeah, just, um, here, there, and everywhere, I suppose.
Final question, I promise. What's the cause for optimism at the moment? Because there's so many kind of negative stories, and you know, I'm sure some people question whether it really is possible to turn this ship Australia around, and make it
Mhm,
a place that people can, raise families, enjoy their life without,
mhm.
crushing um, debt and everything else, and get back to the Australia that, I'm sure you remember and I remember of 20 plus years ago. Is that possible?
I don't think we'll ever get back to that Australia,
Mm.
but I do think that, for every action, there's a reaction. I think, um, the tide is turning. I think Australians have had a gutful of the browbeating, from the extreme left and woke ideology, which has been about, forcing Australians to think a particular way, to speak a particular way. There's been an attack on freedom of speech, um, and I think that the tide is turning, which is something, I suppose, that provides a glimmer of hope, going forward. I think young people are, also, although there are those on my side of politics that are concerned about being able to engage young people and this, that, and the other. It's like, well, young people aren't some different species that we can't connect with. We can still connect with young people. Young people also have to have something to rebel against, and there's certainly definitely young men out there who are rebelling against woke ideology. Being a mother of 4 boys, I know exactly that it's taking place. Um, and we have to be there for our kids. But I think there is a thirst for wanting to feel proud to call ourselves Australian again. And I think because of the voice referendum, it gave Australians the opportunity to stand up for something once more, and to not be afraid to use, their freedom of speech to push back on a lot of the nonsense. Um, and yeah, I think there's much to look forward to, in that regard. Um, but there's still a lot to overcome, at the same time. But I meet a lot of young people, in my travels, and surprisingly, there's so many that are like, "Oh my goodness, thank you for doing what you're doing, and you're inspiring me. Um, and I hear about the conversations that my son, who's at university, has with his friends, and even, other young Indigenous people studying at UTS with him will talk about some of the big issues, and they too feel like, while they might not be terribly vocal, they just want to get on with their lives. They don't want to be singled out by their lecturer. They don't want to be told by their lecturer from the UK on how Aboriginal people think. They they want a career. They want to make money for themselves. They see themselves as capitalists, and why are we being pushed into an identity that we don't want to be in? So I have a lot of hope for the future and for young people, um, who who are asking questions now, who
Mm,
aren't afraid to ask questions and to push back. And I think after we've experienced Charlie Kirk's death, I think there will be there is a turn toward Christianity now, and more young people heading in that particular direction as well, which I see as great hope.
mm,
Mhm.
yeah. Jacinta, fascinating. I love talking to you. Anyone who hasn't read your book, definitely go and read that, because you have lived quite an interesting life, and there's no bitterness.